Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now, what I've got in front of me today is one of the Trench Devils, which is part of an upcoming Kickstarter from Quartermaster 3D. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because I've done a ton of their stuff on the channel before, because I really like the style that they're going for. Now, this is a range of urban specialist trench runner style infantry, along with a whole bunch of other bits and pieces to make an army work no matter what game system you're planning on putting them on the table for. So I'll make sure there's a link to the Kickstarter in the description. As always, all of the paints will be listed in the description too. Now, I've tried to quite closely match what Scott's done with his army, but as always used it more as a point of inspiration and tried to find as easy a way as possible, of getting them on the table. So let's get started. So once your miniature is all printed and cleaned up, the first thing we're going to do is to prime it. Now the primer color you use here isn't actually going to matter a great deal. What I've used is the premium gray from Vallejo. It's one of the spray cans, but anything light will work just fine, whether it's gray sear, even a white, or something like Wraithbone. It doesn't need to be gray. Light is going to make it easier. I just really like using Vallejo's gray for most things these days. Now, same as most miniatures, we're going to start from the bottom up. So the lowest layer on this dude is going to be his uniform. And for that uniform, we're going to start with Field Grey from the Army Painter. Now, if you want to stick to Citadel, you could use here instead Storm Vermin Fur, which is not quite as green, but it's a similar sort of tone. And that's really more what I want than necessarily the color, because the temptation with urban miniatures is always just to paint it a flat grey, shade it black, and call it done. And that's boring. We don't want boring. So I'm going to need to give this a couple of coats. And I'm using here, this is the Army Painter Small Dry Brush, which is actually a brilliant brush for base coating, because it's got a nice wedge tip, which lets you really work it into some of the corners you might otherwise struggle with. 2 coats later, we've got a nice solid field grey. What I'm going to do now is actually turn to Vallejo's Stone Grey, which is this one here. And it's a wonderful, it's not quite brown, it's not quite green. It works as a dry brush for all sorts of things. We're going to use this to add a little bit of texture to the uniform. So I'm going to work most of this off into a little bit of kitchen towel here. And always just quickly dry brush the edge of your base to get a feel for what you're going to leave behind. Then I'm going to quickly flick along the edges, any raised details, just to give us a little bit of texture and to sort of highlight before we have to ourselves. So this saves a lot of time, especially if you're batch painting, 5 or 6 guys, 10 guys at a time. You get a little bit more visual interest on them. They've got some depth, and you don't have to painstakingly do it with a small brush. Now moving up to the next layer, we're going to paint in the leather details. For this, what I've got here is German Camo Black Brown from Vallejo, which is a mouthful. If you do want to stick to Citadel, then Rhinox Hide is an almost perfect duplicate of this. But I'm going to paint in his boots, get in and get his belt too. And make sure you're leaving the belt loops if possible. I'm also going to paint in his gloves. These do look like they've got a little padded back section, but I figured that would all be padded in the same color. And with that done, we can start applying some paint to his leg wraps and around his wrists as well. What I'm using here, this is Morghast Bone. Now, ordinarily, at some point like this, I would use something like Xandri Dust or similar, but these things I don't want to have to highlight if I can avoid it. So I'm going to use a lighter color, and once it's shaded, that's going to do most of the work for us. And this is one of the many good reasons to be using a lighter primer than usual. When you come up to his arms, just avoid his sleeves and his gloves. Don't worry about the armor plating. Now moving on up, we're going to paint in his face mask. And this is an interesting one because I think we tend to overthink painting gas masks on miniatures, especially our sci-fi guys. Now, these things ordinarily aren't lit from within, so why paint the eyes? We always go in painting red or what have you. Once these things are worn and shaded, those lenses are going to look dark brown or black anyway. So I'm not going to bother painting in the eyes. If you do want to see how to do that, I've done it in a couple of the Krieg videos I've done previously. Just do it before you apply this main color, which is Dawnstone, I was about to forget to mention. And you can tidy up around that, but instead I'm going to leave them as they are. I want this mask to look more like a sort of a hard plastic. And with the mask applied, we can start getting into the other armor. Now here I'm switching to another Vallejo color. This is German Grey, which is a really dark, almost blue-black. Now I'm using this instead of something like Corvus Black because the coverage is much better, but it is very similar to Corvus Black. We just don't want to use a true black because once we shade this, we'll have a little bit of depth to it. So take your time, and all of the hard armor stuff as well as his gun. Now suddenly, yeah, there he is. Now what I should have done up on the shoulder pad would be the same as I've done on the knee pad here, which is to try and avoid painting over those stripes, but we'll solve that problem when we come to it. We've got room for another color here on the stock though, and I'm going to paint in the wood with a little bit of Mournfang brown. If you want to save the time though, you could just paint over the whole thing in whatever black color you're using. But yeah, I want a little bit more pizzazz, let's say. Now here, for the same reason as using Morghast Bone earlier, I've got Iron Hand Steel, and I'm going to paint in the metal details. I want to be able to use something nice and light that I don't have to shade later, unless I really want to. So I don't have to highlight it after I shade it, rather. Now let's look at those stripes. What I've got is Corax White here, and a lot of folks have issue with this. It can be a tricky one to get flowing properly, but once you first open it, the first thing you want to do is to drop a couple of agitators in there, and a little bit of Lamy and Medium. You'll need to shake it quite a bit each time you use it, but if you do, what you'll end up with is a white that covers really well. And then at last, we're up to our top stage, and for this I've got Zandri Dust. We're going to paint in the gas cape here, or it might not be a gas cape. In the Facebook previews and everything, the sculptor refers to it as a poncho, so it's really up to you what color you want to do it here. You'll see I experimented with a dark green first. Now, honestly, it kind of sets the tone for the rest of the miniature. If you want to lean into the green look, then I think that would probably be a better choice. Deathcore Drab or something similar there will work well. But I want these guys to be a little bit lighter than how they were turning out. So Zandri Dust, and I'll probably need to give this a second coat. I might have thinned that down a little bit too much. So once at last you've finished all of your base coats, just cruise around, do any tidy up that you need to do. It's time to shade this guy. Now a quick note on what I'm going to use here. This is the old Agrax Earthshade, but I have got some of the new stuff too. The main difference between them is in how they flow. The new stuff is a little gloopier. It flows more like the contrast stuff. If you want it to work like the old Agrax Earthshade, when you open up your pot, just top a tiny little bit of Agrax Earthshade, goodness me, don't keep filling it up. Add a little bit of Lamy and Medium in there. It will thin it out and it will make it behave much more like the old stuff. But since I've still got the old stuff, that's what I'm going to stick to here. So load up my shade brush and we're going to go over the entire miniature. Making sure to really work it into the recesses. And then same as always, I'm going to find somewhere sunny to pop this. Although those are getting harder to find this time of year. And we'll leave it as long as necessary to make sure that this is thoroughly dry. And then once that has dried, you're going to have something that looks like this. Now, honestly, the shade didn't really settle on the cape quite like I would have liked, but the dry brush is going to take care of most of that anyhow. Now, a really common question after shading is people saying, well, my shade's gone shiny, what do I do? Well, we're going to varnish it anyway, it's not going to matter. But we do have a couple of dry brushes to apply. What I've got is a little old makeup brush here, something nice and small, and some Tyrant Skull. Now, I might even need to get a smaller brush. Nope, this is going to be fine. I'm going to take my time, and that's a bit much. Never mind. Let's go around. I'm just going to pick out a couple of the edges on the cape here to give this a little bit more shape and volume. Now, when you're dry brushing up around details like the gun and his arms and what have you, you're probably going to end up with a little bit of dust coming off what you're doing. So get yourself an old dry brush And seriously, it needs to be dry, because if there's any water in it at all at this point, instead of sweeping away that bit of dust, you're just going to turn it into pigment and smear it into the miniature. So, old brush, and yeah, we're going to dust him off before our next stage. Now, try to bear in mind that we are block painting batches of infantry here, so we don't want to spend a huge amount of time on every figure if we don't have to. Nonetheless, I am going to take this guy a little bit further just to show you how it can be done. I'm going to go back to my stone grey, so whatever colour you used to dry brush the uniform itself, just a few little lines of this now will help accentuate some of the sharper details, like folds and edges in his uniform. You don't have to do much of this if you don't want to. It's really a style choice, and that's probably a lot longer than I intended, but whoops. Now what I've got is another ratty, scrangly old brush and some Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm going to very carefully dry brush along the top edge of his lasgun, although I might have taken a little bit too much off of my brush for that to show up at all. Let's add a bit more and try again. Okay, there we go. Now you can theoretically do this to all of the armor as well, but I want his weapon and his armor to look a little different to each other. So I'm going to highlight that differently in a second here. And that'll be to get some Stormhost Silver and a brush which keeps a nice fine tip. Now Stormhost Silver is a paint that really likes to separate if you let it sit for long, so make sure you're giving it a really good shake before you start using it. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of this on some of the metallic details that we've done, just to brighten them up a little. And then with just a tiny little whisper of this stuff on my brush, what I'm going to do is pick a few little edges and carefully dibble, 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 so I get a nice rough edge where it looks like the metal has caught a ding, a dent, a scratch, rather than trying to painstakingly highlight the whole thing. So especially at corners, areas where you'd see natural wear and tear, just tickle your brush along there. Don't try and paint a straight line. And you'll find this lets you highlight your edges a little bit. I find it easier, than having to paint a straight line. So areas where you might have caught with the dry brush earlier, you can rough those up with some silver. It is up to you here. Now the cool thing there is that there's nothing stopping you from adding a little bit more detailing to your rifle, even if you have dry brushed it already. We're going to do just a couple more highlights. At this point, honestly, for basic infantry, I would have stopped ages ago, but you might as well see how to do it. So I've got a little bit of Gawthor Brown, and I'm just going to dibble on the backs of some of these leather details. So his fingers, particularly if you did dry brush the rifle, this is a good opportunity to clean up without having to clean up. And then just a little bit of white scar. We're going to tidy up the white stripes, funnily enough. You don't have to paint a perfect white line here. You can just pick corners to help sell the edge of them. But I'm going to tidy them up a little bit more, make them look a little cleaner. Now finally, before I get to basing him, I'm going to apply a varnish. Now, I could take him outside and hit him with a Vallejo or an Army Painter matte varnish, but what I've got here, this is Varnish Plus from Instar, and it is wonderful stuff. It is super matte once it's dried, so I'm going to apply it carefully with a brush. I don't want it to pull up too much if I can avoid it, but over the whole thing. And once this dries, you're going to see what I mean about, well, don't worry about things drying glossy. Varnish is going to take care of that. Now, doesn't that make a world of difference? Suddenly, all of that shininess is gone, and it brings together things like the dry brushing and our highlights. It looks much more natural with a nice matte on the top. Still a little rougher than I'd like on the cape, but we're going to hand wave that. It doesn't need to be perfect. What I am going to do now is apply a base, and there is a reason why I varnished it before applying the base, but I'll explain that when we get to it. First off, I'm going to put down a layer of Astrogranite, and just take my time as I get around his boots. If I do splatter his boots, I don't care, but I don't want to just cover them if I can avoid it. Then after plenty of time for that to dry, we're going to apply a layer of Agrax Earthshade. We get through this stuff. You'll find that that will soak into the Astrogranite a little rather than acting like a shade normally would, but that is fine. That's exactly what we want it to do in this case. We're going to turn now to the dry version of Dawnstone, although you can try this with the regular version. It's not going to matter too much. Let's just work some of that off. And we're going to start dry brushing over the top of our Astrogranite mix. So once you've gone over the same area a few times and you notice you're not leaving very much behind anymore, what you can do is start carefully brushing up the legs a little bit, making a bit of a mess and applying some of this dust. And this is part of the reason why we haven't bothered highlighting the leg wraps, because we're going to do this grimy, dusty effect. Now it is important that you make sure you've worked most of your stuff out of your brush before you start doing this. Otherwise, you're just going to paint the legs grey, and that's not really what we want. Then we'll do the same thing again. I have here Underhive Ash, and this is a super pale green. I want to be a little bit more selective about where I apply this. It will look super bright going on, but as it dries, it darkens down quite a bit. So go a little light with it to start with, and then same as before, once you're satisfied you've worked most of it off your brush, you can start. I tend to find a sort of a jabbing, stippling motion is the best one here. Let's go up, add a little bit of this to your legs. Now after the dry brush, I've also added a couple of tiny dots of PVA and some Patchy Grass from Warlord Games. I'll make sure that's all popped into the description too, and just painted in his base rim black. But who doesn't love a good height comparison? So from left to right, what we've got is one of the original Cadians, one of the Solaran Dragoons, which is one of the previous Quartermaster 3D printable armies. We've got one of the new Krieg dudes and our Trench Devil from today. So you see, they all scale pretty well against one another. The Trench Devils are pretty close to the Krieg fellas, so they're a little bit more slight than the Cadians are. But when the new ones come along, who knows how that's going to look. Honestly, the point is that since they're 3D printed, you can make them any size you want, but at their default size, I think they're going to print just fine. So let's pop them up on the spinny thing and get a look at the 360. And there at last, our Trench Devil is complete. And I've really enjoyed painting this guy. I think they're going to be really simple to turn out very quick, nice looking armies. The addition of the poncho as just a spot color that'll make them stand out from other stuff on the table is a really nice choice. All in all, there's not a lot that really takes up time to paint them. They aren't covered in gumph, they've got very limited equipment, they look like light infantry, and it works super well. So really looking forward to seeing the rest of the range come together for these guys. So like I said, check out the link in the description to the Kickstarter. That will likely be live by the time this video goes live, but if it isn't, then just wait an hour. It will be up really quickly. So thank you again to Scott for sending me along the samples to have a play with, as well to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, and all of my wonderful patrons for keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support lets me keep buying resin. Any questions or anything, feel free, drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.